My daughter-in-law threw my dead husband's final gift into a trash can, not because it was dirty, not because it was damaged, because it was homemade. She held up the cream-colored baby blanket I had spent 4 months knitting with arthritic hands, wrinkled her nose for the camera, and laughed. "We only use designer things here," she said. Then she dropped it into the trash in front of 20 people. The room laughed because the camera was rolling, and people will do terrible things when they think cruelty has become entertainment. My son Peter was standing by the far wall. He saw his wife throw away the blanket I had made for his unborn baby. He saw his dead father's initials stitched into the corner. He saw me walk quietly across the room, lift the blanket out of the trash, fold it, place it in my bag, and leave. And he said nothing. That silence hurt more than the trash can. But what no one in that room knew was that the blanket was not only wool. Sewn into the lining were 30 years of United States savings bonds my husband had bought for the first grandchild he never lived to meet, just under $50,000. And beside those bonds was the last letter Calvin ever dictated from his hospital bed, sealed for our grandson to open on his 18th birthday. My daughter-in-law thought she had thrown away an ugly homemade blanket. My son thought he had stayed quiet to keep the peace. But sometimes a family does not learn what something is worth until after they have already thrown it away. My name is Mavis Ellington. For 40 years, I ran a small tailoring shop called Bellwether Stitch and Cloth on the corner of Elm and 4th. I spent my life measuring inseams, letting out waistbands, and fixing the frayed edges of other people's lives. I am not a wealthy woman in the way my daughter-in-law understands wealth, but I know the value of a single thread. I know how much time it takes to make something that lasts. The baby shower was held at the home of Aurelia's mother, Giselle. Walking into that house felt less like attending a family celebration and more like stepping onto the set of a lifestyle commercial. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and catered salmon. Everything was curated. The balloon arch was a muted shade of sage green, matching the custom linen napkins and the icing on the tiered cake. I wore my best navy dress. I carried a plain cream-colored box tied with a simple blue ribbon. It was the only gift in the room that did not come in a glossy shopping bag with a recognizable logo. When the time came to open presents, Aurelia sat in a high-backed wicker chair. Her friend Lana stood a few feet away, holding a phone steady to record every reaction. Aurelia unwrapped silver rattles, cashmere onesies, and a high-tech bassinet that monitored a baby's breathing. With each gift, she called out the brand name. Giselle led the room in appreciative applause. Then, Aurelia reached for my plain cream box. She untied the blue ribbon. She lifted the lid. The room went quiet as she pulled out the folded blanket. I had chosen a soft, unbleached wool, and along the edges, I had knitted a border of tiny blue sailboats. Calvin had always talked about taking his grandchild fishing. Aurelia held it up by 2 corners, letting it unfold. She did not smile. She looked at it the way someone might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto a golf course. "Oh," she said. Her voice was flat. "Did you make this?" "I did," I said. "I wanted Arlo to have something from that sweet," Aurelia cut in, not looking at me. She turned toward Lana's camera, her expression shifting into a practiced, pitying smile. "But honestly, we're going with a very specific, minimalist nursery aesthetic. We only use designer things here." Giselle let out a soft, echoing laugh. "Bless her heart," she murmured to the woman next to her. Loud enough for half the room to hear, Aurelia turned. Beside her chair was a decorative woven basket being used to collect wrapping paper and discarded ribbons. Without another word, she dropped the blanket into the trash. The room chuckled. Lana kept filming. I looked at Peter. My son, the boy I had raised to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, looked down at his designer shoes. He shifted his weight. He opened his mouth, closed it, and remained perfectly silent. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose his wife's vanity over his mother's dignity. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene to ruin their aesthetic video. I simply stood up, walked across the sage green rug, and reached into the trash basket. I brushed a strip of tape off the wool. I folded the blanket, placed it carefully into my canvas tote bag, and walked out the front door. The drive home took 40 minutes. I kept the radio off. The only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. When I pulled into my driveway, I did not go inside immediately. I sat in the driver's seat, resting my hands on the steering wheel. My knuckles were swollen. The joints in my fingers throbbed. A dull and familiar ache that flared up whenever the weather changed or whenever I pushed myself too hard. It had taken me 4 months to knit that blanket. With arthritis, every row was a negotiation with pain. There were nights I had to stop and soak my hands in warm Epsom salts just to hold the needles the next morning. But I knitted every stitch because I made a promise. 10 months earlier, Calvin had been lying in a hospice bed in our living room. The cancer had taken his strength, but not his clarity. He had asked me to bring him the old wooden cigar box from the top shelf of our closet. When I opened it, I found stacks of paper, United States savings bonds. Some were faded, dated nearly 30 years ago, bought when Peter was just a toddler. Calvin had bought one every few months, quietly setting aside $25 here, $50 there. For the first grandchild, Calvin had whispered, his voice thin as paper. I won't be here to take a fishing. I won't be here to buy him his first car. Calvin, I had said, the tears spilling over. Don't just hand Peter an envelope, he instructed, his eyes locking onto mine with sudden intensity. You know how Aurelia is. It will disappear into a kitchen renovation or a luxury vacation. Sew it into something they'll keep. Make them open the blanket. Make it last. So I did. I knitted his initials, CE, into the bottom right corner. I created a hidden pocket within the lining of the wool, sealing the bonds and his final handwritten letter inside. I built a fortress of yarn to protect my husband's legacy, and my daughter-in-law had thrown it in the garbage. I picked up my tote bag, walked into my empty house, and set the blanket on the kitchen table. I ran my fingers over the blue sailboats. I had failed to protect Calvin's gift. I had underestimated the sheer gravity of Aurelia's shallowness. But the blanket was safe now. Arlo would still receive his inheritance, I decided, but he would not receive it through the hands of people who could not recognize its worth. I made myself a cup of tea. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. The house was completely silent. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed Peter's name. It was 11:45 p.m. I picked it up. I didn't say hello. Mom, Peter said. His voice was trembling. It wasn't the measured, careful tone he usually used to manage me. It was raw panic. Mom, please. Please tell me you took the blanket home. I took a slow sip of my tea. My son had stood by a wall and watched his wife discard my heart, and now, hours later, he was calling in a panic. There was only one reason he would care about the blanket now. My sister-in-law, Sylvia, had been sitting 2 chairs away from me at the shower. Sylvia knew what Calvin had done. She knew what I had spent 4 months knitting. Sylvia must have pulled Peter aside after I left. "I have the blanket, Peter," I said evenly. I heard a sharp, ragged exhale on the other end of the line. "Oh, thank God, Sylvia." She said something crazy. She said, he stopped, swallowing hard. "Mom, what was inside it?" I looked down at the soft cream wool resting on my table. I thought about the pain in my hands, the 30 years of quiet sacrifice, and the laughter in that curated room. "Why do you ask?" "Peter?" I said. The silence on the line stretched out heavy and absolute. He knew why I was asking. He knew what his silence at the party had cost him. Because sometimes the thing people call cheap is the only thing in the room money could never buy. And sometimes a family does not learn what something is worth until after they have already thrown it away. The line went dead. I did not hang up on my son out of anger, but out of necessity. If I had stayed on the line a second longer, I might have given him the comfort he was desperately seeking. And Peter did not deserve comfort. Not tonight. He deserved exactly what he was feeling in that moment. The crushing weight of his own silence across town in the sprawling, perfectly styled house that Peter and Aurelia had bought with a hefty down payment I had quietly helped provide. The reality of what had just happened was finally breaking over my son. I didn't need to be in the room to know how it played out. Later, much later, Peter would confess every detail of that night to me. He had left the baby shower early, making an excuse about needing to review a contract for work. But he didn't go to his home office. He went out to his car and sat in the dark driveway, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the moment his wife dropped 4 months of my love and pain into a decorative trash can. It was only after Sylvia, Calvin's younger sister, a woman who possessed all of Calvin's sharp observation, but none of his patience, had stormed out of the party and knocked sharply on Peter's car window, that the real damage was done. "Did she take it?" Sylvia had demanded, her face pale in the driveway lights. "Who, Mom?" Peter had asked. "Yeah, she took it. She went home, thank God," Sylvia had breathed out, leaning against the car door. "Because if that girl had actually thrown away $50,000 and Calvin's final words, I would have burned this house down myself." That was the moment the world stopped spinning for Peter. $50,000. His father's final words. He had walked back into his house like a ghost. The baby shower was winding down. Caterers were carrying out silver trays, and Aurelia was sitting on a velvet ottoman, directing Lana on how to pack the designer gifts into the trunk of her SUV. "Aurelia," Peter had said, his voice unrecognizable even to himself, "where is the trash from the gift wrapping?" Aurelia hadn't even looked up from her phone. "The caterers took it out back. Why? Did you throw away a receipt?" "No," Peter said, stepping into her line of sight, forcing her to look at him. "I'm looking for my mother's blanket." Aurelia had sighed, the kind of long, exhausted sigh reserved for a difficult child. "Peter, please, don't start." It was a sweet thought, but it was hideous. It smelled like mothballs, and it completely clashed with the nursery tone. "I'm not keeping clutter just because your mother has too much free time." "There was $50,000 in it," Peter said. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a peaceful room. It was the vacuum of space. Aurelia's phone slowly lowered to her lap. Giselle, who had been instructing a caterer on where to place leftover wine, froze in the hallway. "What are you talking about?" Aurelia asked. The patronizing tone was gone. My father, Peter said, his breathing shallow. For 30 years, he bought savings bonds for his first grandchild. He made Mom sew them into that blanket, along with a letter. Peter looked at the trash basket. And you threw it away. You threw it away in front of 20 people because it didn't have a label on it. Aurelia's face flushed, but the tragedy of Aurelia was that she had been raised by Giselle. When backed into a corner, women like them did not apologize. They defended. How was I supposed to know? Aurelia's voice rose, shrill and defensive. Who sews money into a blanket? That's insane. She should have just given us a check like a normal person. She deliberately didn't tell me to set me up. She was going to tell you, Peter said softly, his own failure wrapping around his throat. You cut her off, and then you threw it away. Well, she took it home, didn't she? Aurelia snapped, standing up, smoothing the front of her dress, as if adjusting her appearance could adjust reality. So the money is safe. Just go over there tomorrow, apologize for the misunderstanding, and bring the bonds back. We can put them in the nursery fund. Peter stared at his wife. For the first time in their marriage, he saw the absolute bottom of her depth and found that he was standing in a puddle. She's not going to give it back to us, Aurelia, he whispered. He was right. I wasn't. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. My hands ached fiercely from the damp cold, but I did not take my pain medication. I wanted to feel sharp. I took the blanket to the kitchen table. With a small pair of silver sewing scissors, I snipped the heavy thread I had used to seal the hidden pocket. It hurt to undo my own work, to open the fortress I had built. I pulled out the stacks of heavy paper, United States Series EE and I savings bonds. I placed them in a leather portfolio, along with the sealed white envelope bearing Calvin's handwriting for Arlo on his 18th birthday at 9:00 a.m. I was sitting in the polished office of a local bank manager. She ran the serial numbers and calculated the matured interest. The total was exactly $47,812.40. This is a remarkable gift, Mrs. Ellington, the manager said softly. It was a lifetime of quiet choices, I replied, placing the bonds back into the portfolio. From the bank, I drove directly to the law offices of Merrick and Vance. Ione Merrick was a trust attorney who had handled Calvin's modest estate. She was a woman in her late 50s who wore severe glasses and never spoke more words than necessary. I liked her immensely. I sat in her leather chair and placed the portfolio on her desk. I need to establish an irrevocable education and trust fund, I said, for my unborn grandson, Arlo Ellington. Ione adjusted her glasses. Funding source, $47,000 in savings bonds. She opened a legal pad. And who will be the trustees? Yourself and Peter. Just myself, I said. And upon my death, the bank will act as the trustee. Ione paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked up at me. You are deliberately excluding the child's parents from having any access or signatory authority over these funds, correct, Mrs. Ellington? I must advise you that setting up a trust this way often creates significant familial friction. Parents generally expect to manage their child's inheritance. The parents, I said evenly, do not know how to manage value. They only know how to manage appearances. This money was saved over 30 years by a man who wore his boots until the soles fell off. It is not going to be used to buy designer strollers or fund an aesthetic nursery. Ione studied my face for a long moment. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply nodded and began writing. The Arlo Ellington Education Trust, she said. The funds will be locked. Principal and interest will only be released for tuition or directly to Arlo upon his 25th birthday. The parents will have absolutely no legal avenue to withdraw a single cent. Make it ironclad, Ione. I always do. As I signed the preliminary documents, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was Aurelia. Then a text from Giselle. Then Peter ignored them all. Calvin's gift was safe, but the lesson was far from over. Locking the money away protected Arlo's future, but it did nothing to fix the rot that had taken hold in his parents' present. You cannot simply hide the truth from people who need to see it. Eventually, you have to force them to look, and I knew exactly when I was going to do it. Arlo Calvin Ellington was born 6 weeks later in a private hospital suite that Giselle had insisted on paying for. When I arrived at the maternity ward, carrying a small, store-bought bouquet of blue hydrangeas, the room was already crowded. There were professional photographers adjusting ring lights in the corner. Aurelia was propped up in bed, wearing a silk robe that had been carefully draped to look effortlessly elegant. Her hair and makeup had been done. Arlo was sleeping in a clear plastic bassinet. He was swaddled in a cashmere blanket with a luxury designer logo repeating across the fabric. I walked past the photographers, past Giselle, who was busy offering aesthetic direction, and stood over the bassinet. I looked down at my grandson. He was tiny, perfect, and completely oblivious to the circus surrounding him. Between his small, sleeping eyes, there was a faint, distinct crease. It was Calvin's frown. My heart broke and healed in the exact same second. Isn't he flawless? Aurelia asked from the bed, pitching her voice for the camera. We're doing his newborn shoot right now. The theme is minimalist heirloom. I looked at her. Minimalist heirloom. She had thrown a true heirloom into the garbage because it hadn't come with a receipt, and now she was buying the appearance of one for an audience of strangers. He is beautiful, I said quietly, touching Arlo's tiny hand. Peter stood near the window. He looked exhausted, hollowed out. Ever since the night of the baby shower, a thick sheet of glass had descended between us. He had tried to bring up the blanket twice in the weeks following the shower. Both times, I had simply changed the subject. I had not told him about the trust. I had not told him anything. Mom, Peter murmured, stepping closer. Thank you for coming. I wouldn't miss it, I said. Aurelia cleared her throat. Mavis, I know there was a bit of a misunderstanding at the shower about your gift, pregnancy hormones, you know. Anyway, we're putting everything behind us. Fresh starts for Arlo. It was a brilliant piece of theater. She wasn't apologizing. She was assigning her cruelty to hormones and dictating a pardon for herself. Giselle nodded approvingly from the corner. Yes, I said smoothly, turning away from the bassinet. Fresh starts. I stayed for 15 more minutes, letting them take their photos, letting them pretend the room wasn't entirely fractured. When I left the hospital, I felt a deep, steady air resolve hardening in my chest. Over the next 2 months, I watched my grandson grow through the curated lens of Aurelia's social media. Every milestone was a production, a designer pacifier, a limited edition stroller, a nursery tour sponsored by a high-end furniture brand. Aurelia and Peter were acting as if the blanket had never existed. They assumed that because I had not caused a scene, I had simply swallowed the insult, just as Peter had swallowed his conscience. They assumed the money was sitting in my savings account, waiting them to charm it out of me when the time was right. They fundamentally misunderstood who I was. When Arlo was 3 months old, I decided it was time. I picked up the phone and made a few calls. I called Peter. I called Sylvia. I even called Giselle. I am hosting a Sunday dinner at my house. I told them each in turn. Just family. It's time we officially celebrated Arlo's arrival together, without cameras or caterers. Giselle hesitated on the phone, clearly dreading a meal in my modest dining room. Oh, Mavis, that's lovely. Should we bring something? A tart? A nice Bordeaux? Just bring yourselves, I said. I have everything prepared. Sunday arrived with a slow, creeping chill in the autumn air. I spent the morning roasting a chicken, peeling root vegetables, and polishing the silver flatware Calvin and I had received on our wedding day 40 years ago. At 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. They filed into my home, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and nervous energy. Peter carried Arlo in a car seat. Aurelia wore a tight, uncomfortable smile. Giselle looked around my living room as if inspecting a museum of quaint antiquities. Sylvia came in last, giving me a sharp, knowing look. Dinner is nearly ready, I said, taking their coats. Please, have a seat in the dining room. They moved into the dining room. I heard the scrape of chairs, the quiet murmurs of forced polite conversation. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, listening. Then I picked up the object I had left resting on the kitchen counter. I walked into the dining room. The table was set beautifully. At the center, where a floral centerpiece would normally sit, the table was bare. I stepped forward and placed the item directly in the center of the mahogany table. It was the cream-colored baby blanket with its blue sailboat border. It was clean, perfectly folded, and completely inescapable. The conversation in the room died instantly. Aurelia's hand froze halfway to her water glass. Giselle's polite smile vanished. Peter went rigidly pale, his eyes locked on the wool fabric as if it were a bomb. Only Sylvia leaned back in her chair, a grim satisfaction settling over her features. I promised Calvin I would give his grandchild this gift, I said, my voice steady, carrying perfectly through the absolute silence of the room. And I believe in keeping my promises. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. I tried to give it to you once, I continued, looking directly at Aurelia, but you deemed it unworthy of your home. So today, I am going to give it properly, so that there is no misunderstanding about what exactly was thrown away. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out a small, sharp metal seam ripper. Aurelia shifted in her chair, her breathing suddenly shallow. Mavis, she started, her voice tight. I said I was sorry about the shower. No, Aurelia, I interrupted, my tone soft but entirely unyielding. You blamed your hormones. You never apologized. I pulled the blanket toward me. The family watched, mesmerized and horrified, as I pressed the sharp point of the seam ripper into the thick wool lining. With a sharp tearing sound that echoed in the quiet room, I sliced open the hidden pocket I had spent so many painful nights stitching together. The ripping of the thread sounded violently loud in the quiet room. I reached into the dark wool pocket. My arthritic fingers closed around the thick stacks of heavy paper. One by one, I pulled them out and laid them flat on the mahogany table. Thick bundles of United States savings bonds. The dates on the paper stretched back 3 decades. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. $47,812, I said, letting the numbers hang in the air. Purchased by a man who drove a second-hand car for 15 years so he could afford to set something aside for a child he knew he would never live to see. I reached into the blanket one final time. I pulled out the crisp white envelope. Across the front, in Calvin's trembling, fading handwriting, were the words, "For Arlo on his 18th birthday." I placed the letter gently on top of the bonds. Aurelia stared at the fortune sitting next to the dinner plates. Her face cycled through shock, greed, and finally, a desperate defensive anger. "That was a trap," Aurelia choked out, her voice trembling as she looked at me. "You set me up. If you had just told me what was inside, I never would have. If I had told you there was money inside, you would have pretended to love the blanket." I cut her off, my voice dropping an octave, stripping away any pretense of politeness. "You would have praised the craftsmanship. You would have smiled for your cameras. But because you thought it was just yarn and time, you threw it in the garbage." "She didn't mean to," Giselle interjected, her voice shrill as she rushed to defend her daughter's image. "Mavis, you must understand the pressure on young mothers today to maintain a certain aesthetic. It's overwhelming. She just made a mistake in the heat of the moment." I turned my gaze to Giselle. "Aurelia didn't invent her cruelty out of thin air, Giselle. You taught her how to look at the world. You taught her that a price tag is the only measure of worth. My only mistake was believing that anyone could look at something made with 4 months of physical pain and throw it away because it didn't have a logo on it." Giselle flinched as if she had been slapped. Aurelia's eyes kept darting back to the bonds on the table. "Fine," she said, her voice tight, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I was wrong. I admit it. I am sorry. Now, can we please put this away? We can take the bonds to the bank tomorrow and put them into Arlo's nursery account." I looked at her. It was staggering, the absolute entitlement. "You aren't taking these bonds anywhere," I said. Aurelia blinked. "But they're for Arlo. You just said they are for Arlo," I said smoothly, "which is why yesterday afternoon my attorney finalized the Arlo Ellington Education Trust. Every single dollar here is legally locked. It will pay for his tuition or it will be released to him when he turns 25. You and Peter have absolutely no signatory authority, no access, and no legal right to touch a single cent of Calvin's money." Aurelia's mouth fell open. She whipped her head toward Peter. "Peter, are you going to let her do this? She is legally stealing our child's money." Peter had been staring at the white envelope bearing his father's handwriting. When Aurelia yelled his name, he slowly looked up. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me. He looked at the swollen knuckles on my hands. He looked at the blue sailboats. "Peter!" Aurelia demanded. "Say something to her." Peter took a slow, deep breath. His shoulders, which had been slumped in a posture of permanent surrender for years, seemed to finally pull back. "Not one more word, Aurelia," Peter said. His voice was low, but it possessed a gravity I hadn't heard from him since he was a young man. Aurelia stared at him, stunned. "Excuse me? You threw my father's heart in the trash," Peter said, his voice breaking, but his gaze holding steady on his wife. "And I let you. I let you do it because I was a coward. I am done being a coward." He looked back at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "The trust is the right thing to do, Mom. Thank you for protecting it." Aurelia sank back in her chair, utterly defeated, stripped of her authority and her audience. Giselle stared at her plate in silence. I picked up the white envelope from the table. "Calvin did not want me to open this until Arlo was 18, I said quietly. "But he told me what the first few lines said. He told me to read them out loud if you ever lost your way." I didn't open the envelope. I simply ran my thumb over Calvin's handwriting and spoke from memory, my dearest Arlo. I am writing this so that long after my bones are gone, you will have proof in your hands that you were wanted. You were loved before you even had a name. Your grandmother made the blanket holding this letter. Look at the stitches. Every one of them is a second she chose to spend on you instead of herself. Learn from her, Arlo. Learn to recognize the difference between things that cost a lot of money and things that are truly valuable. A heavy, absolute silence blanketed the dining room. From the corner of the table, I heard a soft sniff. Sylvia was wiping a stray tear from her cheek. Peter had his face buried in his hands, silently weeping. And Aurelia, for the first time since she had walked into my house, looked at the cream-colored blanket on the table, not with disgust, but with a dawning, terrible shame. I'm keeping the blanket here, I said softly. It will stay in my house. When Arlo is old enough, he can wrap himself in it when he visits. It will go home with him when he is ready to understand it. The consequences of that dinner rippled out long after the plates were cleared. A week later, Lana, the friend who had filmed the baby shower, accidentally posted the full, unedited video of the gift unwrapping to her public social media while trying to create a montage. By the time Aurelia forced her to delete it, the damage was done. The women in Aurelia's aesthetic-obsessed social circle had seen it. They saw the cruelty. Aurelia quickly learned that the people who judge others by their brands will judge you just as ruthlessly. When your mask slips, the embarrassment humbled her. It broke the spell Giselle had cast over her. Peter insisted on marriage counseling. For the first time, he did not back down. They went every Tuesday evening. It wasn't a magical fix, but the power dynamic shifted. The glass wall between my son and me slowly began to crack, and eventually it shattered. 4 months after the dinner, Aurelia came to my house alone. She stood in my living room, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She didn't wear a designer coat. She carried a simple canvas bag. "Mavis," she said quietly, looking at her shoes, "I don't know how to fix what I broke. But I was wondering, could you teach me how to knit?" It was a small olive branch, offered with trembling hands. I could have snapped it. I could have held on to my anger forever. But Calvin had not knitted that legacy to create a permanent war. "Sit down, Aurelia," I said, pointing to the armchair. "I have some extra needles." We spent the afternoon knitting a small, lumpy, terrible winter hat. It was uneven. The tension was all wrong. It was the ugliest thing Aurelia had ever made. When she finished it, she cried, and she kept it. The cream-colored blanket with the blue sailboats remained in my home. But the next winter, I bought new yarn. I began knitting a heavy sweater for Arlo. It was green, the color of pine trees. And on the inside of the left cuff, where no camera would ever see it, I carefully stitched the letters CE. Most people will never notice it, but you don't need a tag to prove what something is worth. You just have to know how to look at stand final CTA. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story gave you something to think about, please leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the stories to come.